Thank you, first of all, for coming in large numbers. My name is Jason Gagno. I'm a head of unit at the OECD Development Center, and I'm happy to be moderating this session this morning on poverty and income inequalities, which was organized with the ILO. I'd like to make just a brief introduction, some brief points on this. The first is migration dynamics are strongly determined by a balancing act between the need or the desire to migrate and improve one's livelihood possibilities and the financial capacity to carry through with it. And in addition to this, migration may also offer a pathway out of poverty or inequality by providing a lifeline back to families through remittances, but also through a number of other things: knowledge, skills, social contacts that one brings back upon returning, or as a member of the diaspora. And as poverty and inequality are both multifaceted, and as migration may provide a pathway out of such circumstances, understanding this interlinkage, the interlinkage between poverty, inequality, and migration, is of central importance to policy. So this session will explore the various ways that those three things, poverty, inequality, and migration, interact, bringing to the fore theoretical foundations and empirical observations from the Global South, and policy and possible policy implications. We have an hour and a half. We're going to go until about 12:15, 12:20. To help us in that task, we have a distinguished panel, which I would now like to briefly introduce. I'm sorry to make it brief, but I encourage everyone to have a look in the folder that was provided for additional details on each speaker. I'll provide each speaker with 10 minutes and to speak, and then after which we'll open I'll make a few observations or reflections from my side, and then we'll open up for comments. And then we'll come back to the panel for their last thoughts, and I'll ask them another additional question related to that. So first we have Jessica Hagen-Zanker from ODI. She's a senior research fellow there, based in London, and she leads their migration research. Welcome, Jessica. We also have online, if he's there, Derejay Feyisa from the College of Law and Governance at Addis Ababa University. Derejay is a scholar with a particular focus on the Horn of Africa. Welcome, Derejay. We have Anita Gimire from the Nepal Institute for Social and Environmental Research, NISER, where she's a director of social science research. Welcome, Anita. And finally, we have Lorraine Wong from the International Labour Organization, where she is a research officer. Welcome, Lorraine. Before we start, I'd just like to announce, first I'm glad to announce that we have very good online participation, and I'd like to encourage our online participants to engage with the discussion today and ask questions in the Q&A that's provided online, and we'll get to those when we move to the room. So Jessica, let's start with you. And let's start with the basics. This is a session on poverty and income inequalities. To what extent can we say that poverty and income inequality determine migration outcomes within the Global South?
Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be speaking at this fantastic event today. Many thanks to the audience in the room and also online for attending, and of course to all the organizers who have contributed to making this such a great lineup. And also thank you, Jason, for setting up this panel and giving us really thought-provoking questions. So Jason, you asked me to what extent does poverty and income inequality determine migration outcomes within the Global South? And that's a really important question that gets to the heart of understanding how migration works, but it also helps us to debunk common assumptions around migration. So I'm going to first give you a one-sentence answer, and then I'll zoom into 5 different themes to give you a flavor of the breadth of the MIDEQ research that sits behind the short answer. So first, for my short answer, poverty and inequality both operate as determinants of migration. since they influence aspirations to migrate and also the outcomes of migration. But at the same time, monetary determinants aren't everything. First, research has demonstrated time and time again that those who migrate are generally not the poorest. And also second, migrants are real and multidimensional people, as we already heard in the opening plenary. And also migration is a real life process characterized by messiness and subjectivity that can also be very influential in shaping these outcomes. So having given you this short answer, I'll now delve into some of our research in a bit more detail. So my first theme is on the relationship between poverty and migration. Broadly speaking, the relationship between poverty and migration is negative. So the higher the poverty, the lower the migration. MIDEQ research has confirmed what we already know from a large body of research. Migration is incredibly costly, and generally speaking, of course, it doesn't apply in all contexts, but generally speaking, the poorest of the poor are unable to migrate because of structural obstacles. For instance, on the Nepal-Malaysia corridor, the documents needed for migration and the recruitment fees, which are very high, mean that families often save for several years or take on very high loans to allow a family member to migrate. And you'll hear more about that from Anita. This also means that when families have access to other sources of income, they may use them to finance migration. For instance, with Jason, we did an analysis on the links between social protection and migration, where we summarized more than 70 studies. And that review showed that sometimes receipt of social protection transfers leads to increases in migration because the stable income source allowed other household members to migrate. My second theme is on aspiration versus ability. When we drill down into migration decision-making, we see that it's a complicated process that involves many aspects. And in particular, there are two critical steps, having the aspiration to migrate and then also having the ability to migrate. So more specifically, faced with risky environments, difficult circumstances, and poor prospects, individuals and their families have to decide how to deal with these risks, and they can do this in different ways. Migration can be one option to deal with these risks, but even when people have the aspiration to migrate, they may not always have the ability to do so. Poverty and inequality can affect both the aspiration and the ability to migrate. While the latter, that it affects the ability to migrate, is obvious, the former is maybe a bit less intuitive, but there is a link, for instance, between inequality and migration aspirations. The literature here shows that the more unequal a society, the greater the aspirations to migrate, whereas in more equal societies, aspirations tend to be lower. My third theme is on the benefits versus the barriers from migration. We know that not everyone benefits from migration equally, and that's because there are barriers that are put in place to manage migration. There's a clear hierarchy in migration, as Heaven already alluded to earlier as well, with migrants who have higher levels of skills or financial resources welcomed widely, while those with lower skills or coming from the global south or having the wrong skin color broadly perceived as a threat to host countries, despite labor shortages in many countries and a strong demand for cheap labor. So as a result, stopping unwanted migration has been a key policy priority in many global north countries for many years now, and they're willing to spend huge sums of money to stop migration. And we don't just find such rhetoric and actions in global north countries. In our MIDEQ research, we also saw xenophobia, mistrust, and barriers put in place for migrants in many of the MIDEQ countries we studied, such as, for example, South Africa and Brazil. And these political processes means that migrants who are deemed unwanted on the political level, but in fact very much needed in host countries, often end up in the informal economy where they're paid lower wages, and often lack documentation to access basic services or integrate fully into host countries. And the data collected in the Ethiopia to South Africa and Nepal to Malaysia corridor also showed this, and I think you'll hear a bit more about it. And that means that these restrictive policies are wasteful in the sense that they don't stop migration, but more important, they also make migration riskier and more dangerous and more expensive. And it means that those who could benefit from migration the most are the ones that are least able to, while those who are already in a position of power benefit even more from migration. My fourth theme is on the policy encounter space. And our research showed that migration policies don't necessarily have the effects intended by policymakers because the content of policies is transformed from policy discourse to design, from paper to actual implementation, and then critically also in their encounter by migrants, and that's what we focused on in particular. And whether migration policies are effective depends on three things. Firstly, are migrants even aware of policies? In practice, this is often not the case, or information about policies is in languages or channels that are not accessible to the target population of those policies. Second is, how is that information interpreted? Information isn't neutral. How migrants make sense of information depends on their personal circumstances, their experiences, and personal traits. People are more likely to trust information that confirms what they already know or believe, a so-called confirmation bias. How information is shared is also critical. Social networks can enhance or prioritize certain information, while information shared by foreign governments is more likely to be distrusted. And finally, what action do people take in response to the policies? Do people agree with the aim of the policies, and do they take the intended actions? We know this is often not the case. And whether they agree or not, it really depends on the specific policy. We found that migration decision-making appears to be more strongly influenced by policies that make travel and access a little easier than those that are restrictive. And then the final theme is bringing in subjective factors. We're all aware of tangible factors that shape migration decisions, such as income differences, migration networks, or education opportunities, and they're also in the name of this panel. But MIDEQ research has shown the spotlight on another set of factors that has often been sidelined, in part because they're harder to measure. And we showed that subjective and intangible factors are just as important in the formation of migration aspirations, as well as directly on the more concrete aspects of migration decisions, such as whether to go, where to go, and how to go. And we identified 4 important groups of these factors in our research. Firstly, researchers have started reflecting on the role of imagination. So the mental journeys that people make prior to migration. And these mental journeys and thoughts, they have real life consequences. For instance, MIDEQ research explored the image of South Africa for Ethiopian prospective migrants. And young Ethiopian men see South Africa as a country where they can establish themselves economically and socially, increasing their social status and ultimately becoming someone. Second is personality and attitudes towards risks. Migrants often have different personal traits to those who stay back. For instance, a study showed that migrants this was a study of internal migrants in Ghana and Indonesia, and it showed that migrants have higher degrees of patience than non-migrants. And there's many studies like that that show migrants often tend to have quite different personality traits. And there's also a strong evidence base showing that migrants are more willing to take risks. The literature has also focused on feelings and emotions such as hope or jealousy or fear, acknowledging that far from being rational economic agents, individuals and their decision makings are emotionally charged. And then finally, we're also seeing increasingly evidence that individual beliefs and values such as religious and spiritual beliefs, political beliefs, and the value placed on material goods shape migration decisions. And you'll hear more about this from Dereje. So I hope my examples have given you a good overview of the importance of poverty and inequality in determining migration outcomes, but also showing that there are a lot of other factors that we need to look at beyond these. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jessica. And debunking common assumptions and concepts. I think we will definitely come back to that during the discussion. We're going to move online virtually. Dereje, if you can hear us.
Yes, can you hear me?
Reminded us of the importance of the human dimension of migration, and that not all the relevant factors are financial or even tangible. Can you unpack that for us, drawing on your work of migrants between Ethiopia and South Africa? And how can we better understand and account for those intangible connections, those associated with migration, for instance, through art, culture, and spirituality? What's yours?
Thanks, Jason. Can you hear me?
We can.
Great. Good morning, everyone, and greeting from Addis Ababa. I'm really sorry that I'm not able to attend this very important policy symposium in person. My name is Dereje Feyisa, and I am the co-I for the Ethiopia-South Africa corridor. And the focus of my intervention is the role of intangible factors in migration process with a focus on values and beliefs. And stock taking of the available knowledge indicate that migration processes are often explained in economic terms, both at the level of aspiration and capability. This is, above all, reflected in the claim that people migrate because of an absolute or relative deprivation, and that who migrates depends on who can afford to cover the cost of migration. Economic factors certainly play an important role in why people migrate. However, the fixation on economic factors has come with a reality cost, to the extent that non-economic factors in migration processes are not given the attention they deserve. The non-economic factors are typically neglected, as Jessica already mentioned, in the academic literature and in policy debates, probably because it is a much harder story to tell. And seeking to bridge this knowledge gap, MIDEQ research findings have shown that going beyond the economic lens provide important insights into migration processes. And in my brief intervention now, I focus on two aspects of these non-economic factors from the case study the Ethiopian MIDEQ team has done, specifically the Hadia of Southern Ethiopia and their migration to South Africa. Above all, the non-economic factors help us better understand why there is a geographic concentration of the origin of Ethiopian migrants in South Africa. There's a very sizable number of Ethiopian migrants in South Africa. Most of them come from Southern Ethiopia, specifically in the area where we have focused our study, which is the Hadia administrative zone. And here I provide two examples how non-economic factors or intangible factors have been intimately implicated in Hadia migration processes to South Africa. First is Hadia mobility norms. Hadia as a people cherish mobility. The very local term for migration, which is in Hadia, dar firma, indicates how human mobility is conceived as something desirable, not a problem to be managed. This forms part of in their perspective, the natural scheme of things. Historically, the Hadia proved to be border crossers par excellence, and the youth who lack an exploratory mindset and the experience of going far were described in feminine terms. In short, territoriality is feminized in order to encourage the youth to go out and explore the world. Heroes are those who go out and explore the world and make use of new opportunities and contribute to the enhancement of the Hadiyah public good and come back. The Hadiyah they are the first to seize emerging opportunities locally, nationally, and also internationally. For instance, during the agricultural labor market, when global capital made it for the first time into Ethiopia in the 1960s in sugar plantation, far from their areas, the Hadiyah were the first to make use of that new opportunity structure. And when the word spread out that South Africa provided a new opportunity structures in the mid-1990s or in post-apartheid South Africa, again, they were one of the first groups of people who quickly moved there despite their apparent drawbacks and challenges such as lack of skill, language competence, etc. As such, Hadiyah's international migration to South Africa is the latest iteration of Dar Firma, their local concept of human mobility. Hadiyah's international migration is also situated within a historical context, and to what extent migration to South Africa has enabled them to redress historically shaped regional inequality within Ethiopia. And in that sense, these values are deployed and redeployed in changing contexts, and here you find the very important role migration plays in the redress mechanism of a certain form of social inequality. So in MIDEQ, we don't take inequality for granted and we start working on it, but we also pose the question how a particular form of social inequality is historically constituted. And Hadiyah form part of the broader Ethiopia's periphery. Now they are no longer the periphery that they once were, thanks to the transformational impact of remittance and migrant businesses. Another non-economic factor which provides us a very useful lens to fully comprehend, to fully comprehend Hadiyah's migration to South Africa is spiritually situated within the wider tradition of evangelical Christianity. And the majority of the Hadiyah people we studied are evangelical Christians. The foundational prophecy that undergirds the mass migration of Hadiyah to South Africa is the 2001 prophecy by a Canadian pastor who came to Hosanna and then delivered God's redemptive message to the Hadiyah as a people. This also says something about how migration features as basically as a collective project. In this sense, God has opened a southern door to the Hadiyah through which prosperity would come. Although the Canadian pastor stopped short of mentioning South Africa by name, the very reference to South was interpreted by the Hadiyah as sacralization of the Ethiopia-South Africa corridor. Local prophets further elaborated on this divine script for migration, which is increasingly felt as a prophecy fulfilled. At the transformational impact of the transnational flow of finance, ideas, and goods in this Ethiopia-South Africa corridor appeared to have produced evidence for the imagination of South Africa as a sacred destination. The process of Hadiyah migration to South Africa is imbued with spirituality, from decision-making, risk negotiation, and place-making in destination places, and for some, and even for the decision for return migration. To conclude, a comprehensive understanding of migration processes, more so in the global South, entails a thorough engagement with non-economic drivers of migration, and of course, how the non-economic or intangible factors interact with the more tangible economic factors. Only then we produce knowledge about migration processes useful for evidence-based policy making. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Derje, for those very good comments, and you're bringing in the intangible side of factors and determinants on migration. Anita, Jessica alluded to poverty and inequality as determinants of migration. Derje brought in the intangible elements, including on how migration may act on poverty and inequality in communities of immigrants. I'd like to keep this focus on the country of origin in the global south. How does migration affect poverty and inequalities in the countries of origin? And can you provide us with examples of channels through which this occurs, such as the transfers of financial, maybe social, maybe human capital?
Thank you for the very interesting and timely panel, Jason. And also thanks to the organizers for all the effort they've put into making this symposium. The way migration affects poverty and inequalities in countries of origin are mixed and very complex. To put it out very generally, and I say very generally, in short-term, migration has potential to reduce poverty and inequality, but in the long term, there is no strong evidence that of overall positive impact or sustainability of impacts of migration, I would say. So the first thing, and as also Jessica and Dreze pointed out, is the existing understandings are not complete. This is because common measurements, which measure migration impacts in tangible terms, such as poverty, remittances, or even vertical and horizontal inequality, they don't lend themselves to bring out the complexity of the impacts because they measure immediate, like very short term, and largely tangible kind of impacts. We also find other challenges. What comes consistently in our study is the fact that largely in sending countries, lifestyle is family and community oriented. And migration objectives are directly or indirectly from these habitus of family and community norms and ideals. And if you look at the receiving countries, migration, while it kind of fulfills much needed labor in the country, it is more about, the whole perspective is more about control, and it's about, how do you call it? It's about control, and it's about use of the workers. So the existing methodologies that do not take into account these nature of the habitus and the social fields. And there's also additionally the current understanding and impact, as I said, are derived from a very relatively short time frame. And there's a gap in research that encompasses all the contextual change in the origins and the destinations that shape the outcomes of the migration. I mean, COVID has shown a very good example of this to all of us. But nevertheless, Dishan, I'll try to discuss here a few outstanding impacts, both positive and negative. Firstly, we should keep in mind that inequalities are persistent in home communities, and our research shows that such inequalities related, for example, to language, gender, migration cycle of the community, they strongly affect migration costs, the support system that migrants can lean to, migration pathways, and thus they affect the poverty and inequality. In the destination, some of these inequalities have been found to be perpetuated, which means that certain groups are more discriminated based on the inequalities in the origin, and thus the outcome of migration is also unequal. If we look at poverty and positive impacts on families, for a short time period and when successful, migration is seen to have helped increase family income. When migrants have sent remittances, families have been able to afford better housing conditions, accumulation of small assets to fight future risks. Families were better able to afford quality education for children and better health for family members. Loans are also easier for migrant households than for non-migrant households. And also in places where there is contribution-based social protection system, it's much easier for the migrants to use the state's social protection systems. All the above increased income has brought out reduction of vertical and horizontal inequalities, at least for a short term. For example, in many countries of South Asia and in Nepal, it has helped. Our research on bonded labor has shown that migration has led to families moving out of bondedness and slavery, and this is very important contribution of migration. It has broken the feudal client-patron relationship, a form of slavery and bonded labor system in Nepal, for example. This system was, there are stigmatization, physical and sexual violence on bonded labor were rampant in this system. So it has helped families move out of such exploitative conditions. It has also importantly reduced child labor, caste and caste-based inequalities, which is very prominent in South Asia. and people in risky jobs. It has also, in some cases, reduced gender gaps in education. In the country, to give you the example of Nepal, it has helped fulfill the much needed foreign currency reserve. It has helped to help the country to cushion against shocks, for example, recurring floods and earthquake and pandemic like the COVID. And it has importantly contributed to the country's GDP, which is currently 23.8% of the country's GDP is from remittances. However, when the worker is unable to earn or reported due to various reasons, dies or comebacks with disability status, families have been pushed further into poverty. And in the long term, as I said, we have not been able to harness this short-term impact and turn it into a long-term and positive impact. For example, our qualitative evidence from MIDEQ and other projects shows that when root causes are unaddressed, in the long term, migration has rather increased horizontal inequality and reduced well-being. I'll give you the example. For example, despite increased investments in children's education, which comes as the #1 reason for migration, dropout, alcoholism, drug abuse, and behavior problems are reported to be high in the families of the migrants, among the adolescent and the children from migrant families. Negative attitudes, including stigmatization related to gender ideals, are high for spouse and children of migrants. GVP, including domestic violence from family members and community, comes out more significantly in migrant households. And there are increased gender gaps in between returnee men and women. Family fragmentation is also high among migrant families, and so are increased emotional burdens for children and psychosocial problems among migrants. And all these will have repercussion on inequality and poverty. The other most significant negative impact is a strong reinforcement of traditional harmful practices, in particular in South Asia, the dowry system, Nepal, Pakistan, India. In Nepal, for example, migration has significantly increased dowry price and high expenses in marriages and other social functions in communities. This in turn has brought significant inequality between economically well-off people and those who are not so well-off, poor families, and increased child marriages and put families in debt traps. So these are some of the negative impacts. Additionally, the lack of supporting entrepreneurial environment, such as easy access to process information, poor insurance against venture failures for migrants, means that there is not so much of a net gain from the use of migrants' financial and knowledge capitals. Hence, in the long term, we found that migrant households were found to slip back into financial crisis once migration stops. And this has led to remigration, intergenerational perpetuation of migration in the families, most importantly, boys dropping out of education to take turns to migrate instead of the father. It can also be seen by the high rate of remigration in the South Asian countries. For Nepal in particular, migration of skilled manpower has led to reduction of use of country's resources or expansion of services. It has hampered the culture of entrepreneurship we had in our country and has led to a dependent economy and lack of export. Furthermore, the focus on remittance in destination in migration narrative perpetuates injustice and inequality for migrants in terms of wage, working condition, leading to conditions of forced labor. Basically, I would like to say that what we know now has not been able to depict the impact on poverty and inequality from a migrant's emic perspective. In the Asian philosophy, there is a saying that you cannot understand a flower by dissecting it, into petals and calyx or corolla. I mean, they make the part of the flower, but the flower in totality is a very different thing. And I think this is the case with our understanding of migration now. I'll stop here, Jason.
Thank you so much, Anita. And thank you for making the point about the sustainability of the impacts and the fact that they're not necessarily long-term, and they often remain short-term. You brought up a lot. You brought up a lot of things that other panelists also alluded to. The issue of intangibility, the intangible factors. You brought up the issue of measuring and how it's not always the adequate way and the most appropriate way for us to measure those impacts. You very importantly brought up the issue of decent and risky jobs. We now turn to Lorraine, who's going to speak to us about data And it's obviously very central for our understanding of the links between migration, poverty, and inequality. But it's costly, it requires resources, we don't always collect the information in the same way. And importantly, we've been speaking about concepts for which identifying data collection strategies is not clear. How can data collection, Lorraine, be improved to address the complex relationship between poverty, income inequality, and migration? And how can we monitor decent work, for instance?
Thank you, Jason, for raising this very important question that is on data collection and methodologies. I also wanted to thank Anita for mentioning some very core issues that ILO fundamentals work on, which is like child labor, forced labor, and also child marriages. So through the analysis of household surveys and administrative data, as you have also heard in the opening remarks, migrant workers are 3 times more likely to be in forced labor than non-migrant workers. And compounding crises like climate change and also humanitarian crisis, poverty, income inequality, forced and unsafe migration can all increase the vulnerability and risk of modern slavery. So it's very important for us to understand the interconnection of these issues. So before talking about how can data and also like methods be improved, I also thought of mentioning some obvious challenges in the measurement of the complex relationship between poverty, income inequality, migration, and decent work. So conventional survey instruments are often not equipped to capture the hidden population subjected to labor exploitation or population on the move, which can result in survey bias. And another thing is, not all households include migrants. So to capture the destination and or return migrants with sufficiently large sample size, the survey can be costly and complex to implement. And also in the case of labor exploitation, workers might be reluctant or they might refuse to respond to these sensitive questions because they might be in danger after telling us like what happened. And also the calculation of reliable statistics require up-to-date and comprehensive register for sampling and extrapolation purposes. And but however, the MIDEQ data were collected in the COVID-19 restrictions in 2021 and also in the South-South migration corridors, which may not have comprehensive registers. So thanks to the support of MIDEQ country teams for collecting the data, as well as thanks to the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine for cleaning the data, we're able to learn more about these important issues. And following the International Conference of Labor Statisticians, ICLS guidelines, concerning the measurement of forced labor, we observe migrants in the MIDEQ data who are working involuntarily, as in working without free and informed consent. So for example, some migrants reported that they cannot leave the employer or they're not allowed to take time off. And also from the MIDEQ data, we learn about remittance flows. The poverty-reducing effects of remittances has been well documented, and Jessica also mentioned that earlier. But in some cases, remittances can help the distribution of income and lower inequality. The MIDEQ data show that in Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, and Brazil, more than half of the sample sent remittances to their families in home countries. We also find a striking 98% of the MIDEQ sample in Cote d'Ivoire, 73% of people in Brazil, and 14 of those in Ghana say that often or sometimes they do not have enough money to cover their basic monthly expenses like food, housing, medicine, or hygiene products. So drawing from the experience of MIDEQ data and also other experiences, I want to highlight like 3 main suggestions to improve the quality and comprehensiveness of data. So first is through pilot studies, standards, and partnerships. Another is through addressing ethical considerations. And finally, by complementing quantitative data with qualitative data. So when it comes to pilot studies, data standards, and partnerships, pilot studies are less costly than full-scale household surveys, and they can help assess the effectiveness of new sampling strategies or questionnaires to ensure that they're effective in reaching the target populations or assess the target indicators. So for example, in ILO, we have done pilot studies and tested a sampling method in Vietnam on decent work in the supply chains. And the pilot studies basically help us to assess the feasibility of our approach and whether or not we should invest more time to do this work, right? And another thing about standardizing the way data are collected, we can make the data to be more usable. And also by standardizing the way these indicators are computed, we can make statistics more consistent and also comparable. So for example, we're working with IOM, UNODC, University of Georgia to develop a global measurement framework for estimating the prevalence of trafficking in persons, including standardized tools, methods, and guidance to help countries and to work with countries to generate comparable and consistent data. And another example is that in one of our MAP 16 and Research to Action projects, we're providing training to national statistical offices to use the standard sets of survey questions to construct indicators related to employment and labor exploitation. So now I wanted to move on to talk a little bit about ethical considerations. Researching the complex relationship between migration, poverty, inequality, and decent work requires an understanding of vulnerability and also the way that a lot of different contexts that other speakers on the panel also talk about. And it can affect risk related to the research. And we also need to be aware of the potential impact of our work on participants' life, right? Like they're all real people after all. So therefore, we need to assess and mitigate the risk of harm and identify and implement measures to protect participants. So for example, we're soon launching the ethical guidelines for research on child labor and forced labor. And the guidelines will provide some guiding questions, suggested steps, and also examples to help researchers identify the ethical issues with research involving migrants and also exploited individuals. Finally, I wanted to talk a little bit about improvement of data collection and methods through complementing statistics with qualitative data. So while quantitative data can present statistics and trends, qualitative data can capture the context and also the perspectives of those who are affected. It helps to tell the story, right? And qualitative data can basically help us to deeper into root causes of issues, experiences and needs of migrant communities, and whether certain policies or programs are working on the ground. So for example, we're working on a paper on freedom of association and collective bargaining, and to complement the MIDEQ data, we're conducting key informant interviews with trade union representatives and identify specific challenges in engaging migrant workers in the MIDEQ destination countries. So in conclusion, I've basically offered 3 methods to improve data collection and methods that are related to pilot studies, data standards and partnerships, addressing ethical considerations, and also complementing quantitative analysis with qualitative data. So I'm going to pass the mic back to Jason, and thank you so much for this panel discussion.
Thank you so much, Lorraine, and a particular thanks for not only posing the challenges that we're faced with, but also paving a way forward on how we may want to overcome that, and actually feeding a bit our reflections for the open room discussion we'll have afterwards, and also mixing in the qualitative and quantitative approaches to addressing migration challenges and maximizing its benefits also. Before we move to the room, I'd like to take a few moments to provide a few reflections from my side as the role of discussant. And I'd like to focus on the policy implications of what we've heard from the 4 panelists, drawing with a focus on the Global South, but drawing on MIDEQ and then drawing also on some work being done at the OECD. We're growing unequal. This is the message we hear from Thomas Piketty. This is the message we get from Branko Milanovic. It's the message that we've We've worked on at the OECD generally. We're not necessarily growing unequal across countries. There's tangible evidence of convergence across countries, although the COVID pandemic may have put the brakes on the speed at which that was happening, but we're growing unequal within countries. And the change is perceptible to the naked eye. In most countries today, most people believe that income disparities are too large and that intergenerational mobility is too low. And that comes across on several surveys done in several countries. Hindsight is 2020, however, and a major debate, if you remember, around the SDGs was around the emphasis on poverty or the emphasis on inequality, or absolute or relative poverty for the pundits. Where is inequalities placed in global policy discussions? And specifically in migration policy discussions, we rarely make the connection with migration. And while inequality concerns didn't figure explicitly in the MDGs, they do in the SDGs, and the primary migration-related objective falls under Objective 10 on inequality. However, inequality doesn't really figure prominently, or didn't actually figure at all, in the Global Commission on International Migration many, many years ago, and doesn't really feature prominently in the GCM. And this is why last year, MIDEQ and all of our partners organized at the International Migration Review Forum, we set out a panel to review progress, not only on the GCM, but also on how inequality was perceived in the GCM and how it could be perhaps a little bit more mainstreamed. And it's also why MIDEQ is highlighting those policy concerns of migration and inequality at the 2023 MISCO annual conference in Warsaw this past summer. I think it's useful to start asking whose inequality are we actually concerned with? There are lots of different levels here. There's inequality between migrants and non-migrants in the country of destination. And we heard some of that here, there's inequality between the migrants themselves. Derje alluded to that with the HITA. In the country of destination, during transit, this is something we haven't heard about much. Between migrant households and households that do not have access to migration in the country of origin. With all that being said, I'd like to just bring in 3 quick reflections on policy that come out from what I thought about when I heard what we all heard today. First, I'd like to speak about migration policies, and Jessica began alluding to that as one of the determinants about aspirations and the ability, and more specifically on the issue of safe, orderly, and regular migration. The term is often used in reference of flows from south to north, but as we've heard, regional mobilities across Latin America, across Africa, across Asia are not only high, they're likely to grow. And it turns out, to go back to Jessica's point about the ability to move, it turns out that the ability to move is severely constrained in the policy area in certain areas of the south. Sub-Saharan Africa has the highest cost of visas in the world, and they are particularly high for other African nations, accounting for weeks, if not months, of monthly wages. And if we ordered the regions according to the cost of visas, you'd find that the next areas would be South Asia, Southeast Asia, Central Asia, and North Africa. And so you get this picture about how policies are constraining the movement and the ability for people to move within their own regions. These 4 African countries currently have visa-free travel for other African countries. And so if we're going to discuss South-South migration and inequality, we must include how policies positively or negatively select the people that move within those regions. The second point I'd like to bring up is a reflection on other types of policies, not just the migration policies. Jessica again alluded to this idea that it's not the poorest that migrate, and this translates to countries as well, except while the poorest countries have particularly low immigration rates, so do high-income countries. And those with the highest immigration rates are somewhere in the middle, which suggests a nonlinear relationship between economic wealth, or GDP, and immigration rates. And this speaks to 2 things that I heard today. The first was it speaks to the intangible factors that Derje shared with us, because wealth in the country does not necessarily lead to better livelihoods or dignity. And so as countries get wealthier, and as families get wealthier, they often migrate because the conditions in which they find themselves are still not caught up necessarily. They might not necessarily have jobs just because the country is growing in terms of GDP. And while this seems to be borne out generally in history and across countries, no path necessarily looks the same for any country. I'd like to posit that the difference from one country to another has much to do with different things we heard today, including the characteristics of countries such as language, colonial ties, geography, migration policies, as I pointed out earlier, but also non-migration policies. And the paper we prepared for MIDEQ on social protection that Jessica mentioned earlier lends credit to that notion. It lends credit to the fact that social protection, which is not necessarily a very specific migration policy, might influence the way that people perceive their ability to migrate or their need to migrate, and so might influence how that curve looks like for those countries. This all has important implications because we know two of the regions with the lowest immigration rates in the world, Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, also have demographic transitions that will lead to somehow migration pressures within regions or across regions. And the way this is addressed through public policies will determine how unequal or equal the future of migration will balance on from these regions. My last point is, how do we mobilize the political will to prioritize addressing migration challenges and maximizing its benefits? And one way to look at that, or one way to uncover that, whether migration is being prioritized, is to look at national development planning and to look at how migration is referenced in those documents. We looked at the OECD at 92 long-term strategies and 66 short-term strategies in low and middle income countries from 1997 until 2023. And there's some good news and some bad news. I'll start with the bad news because it improves. The bad news is that migration is still not necessarily mainstreamed. It's not necessarily a common theme across national development plans. You have about half of the countries that reference it at least once, and often it's referenced in a protective or security fashion. I'd like to spend more time thinking about the good news because it's particularly good and it's going in the right direction. The first thing is that there's an increasing amount of references that link migration and development. And what I'd like to point to here and give you a few numbers is on linking diasporas with the development in their countries of origin. 17% of all the references, the entire references that we found across all of these 158 development plans, refer to diasporas in a positive way for the development of their country, whether that's through remittances or through some sort of engagement or action on their origin country. About 50% of countries refer to that at least once, in at least the diasporas. But the very good news is that we took a subset, an additional subset to those national development plans with countries where we had at least 2 national development plans over time, and we found that there is an increasing amount of references between migration and development. Countries are, the countries in which we had, those 22 countries in which we had 2 national development plans were more likely to refer it in the second wave of collection that we did. And so there's an upward trend on trying to link migration with development in these countries. And another reason for addressing migration in national development plans is not only to ensure migration is properly managed and that people can benefit from it, but also to connect it and leverage it and its benefits to the broader challenges faced by these countries. And Federico mentioned it in his opening remarks. There are lots of major challenges that are much broader and where migration could help ease the transitions, such as green transition, the digital transition, the future of work, things that obviously the ILO is all over right now. These are the ways that these are some of the tools that can be turned to maximize the benefits of migration and also minimize its costs.